what we're seeing here is something similar, maybe, to what we see back in the days of the Prophet. If you were to visit Central Arabia, okay, the Najd, around the year 1700, you would find an area very much off the beaten track. Okay, this is a place where the population is divided between oasis dwellers, scattered in small villages. I mean, a few places that could be called towns, but not much more than that. And nomads, Bedouin. And these people, divided into tribes and clans, were almost always at each other's throats, it seemed. Clan rivalries, blood feuds, raids. Raids were very common. See, under Muhammad, one of his great innovations was the creation of a super tribe, an ummah of Muslims. Muslims don't raid other Muslims. Eventually, they began to raid out, and thus was born the Arab Empire. But things have devolved now. Ottoman wars have sapped a lot of the economic growth. It's sapped the pilgrimage routes of pilgrims. That used to be a major part of the economy of the Najd. Now, most pilgrims actually didn't go through the Najd, but some did. There was a trickle of pilgrims that went through the Najd, and that was an important part of the economy. I mean, besides that, you've got the animals of the nomads and the date palms of the oases, and not much else. So when that trickle starts to dry up as a result of war, we see an uptick in raiding, an uptick in instability in Central Arabia. You would have also found a people steeped in sort of folk Islam, a version of Islam, you see this all over the Muslim world, that has taken on accretions, okay? Traditions, rites, customs, beliefs that are not technically part of the core doctrine of Islam. Things like, visiting tombs, looking for miracles, or intercession of the saints whose tombs those are between you and God, or sacrifice, or amulets and magic and sorcery and all sorts of stuff that is sort of like this added layer on top of Islam. In fact, if you talk to most regular people in the Najd, as across much of the Islamic world actually in 1700, but if you talk to most people in the Najd, your regular Joe, your regular Najdi, he or she probably couldn't tell you much about the actual core doctrines of Islam. Well, into this milieu is born around 1703 a child named Muhammad ibn Abd. Now, Muhammad ibn Abd, he's born into a sort of minor scholastic family of the Najd. There aren't really any super well-known religious families in the Najd. Most scholars are in Mecca and Medina if they're on the peninsula. But his grandfather was at least locally known theologian, and his father is the religious judge of the oasis where they live, Uyayna, which is just a few miles northwest of where I'm standing. So he's born into this sort of a religious academic tradition, nothing super impressive. But when he's of age, he goes on an academic tour. He goes to Mecca, he goes to Medina, where he studies religion. Okay, that's where you go if you want to study religion. And he's rubbing shoulders there with all sorts of people. We know that one of his teachers was from India. He probably had multiple teachers and fellow classmates from India. And that's important because India is undergoing great change at the time. The Muslims have been dominant in India for many centuries, but recently that seems to be changing. Not only have Europeans shown up, they haven't really made waves yet, but not only have Europeans shown up, but the Hindus are ascendant, the Hindu Marathas. And so something seems to have gone wrong. That's one of the things about Islam is history seemed to be on Islam's side for so long. Karen Armstrong has compared history to a sacrament for Muslims. If Islam is being practiced correctly, it seems like history would go the Muslims' way, politically, militarily. They're so long dominant. When things start to go wrong, well, something must be wrong with the Ummah. There must be something wrong with the purity of the Islam being practiced. And so these are ideas that are coming particularly out of India, which is the first major region in the Islamic world to really change and be affected by upheaval caused by non-Muslims. So he studies in Mecca, he studies in Medina. Maybe he rubs shoulders with great revivalist scholars, or at least future great revivalist scholars like Shah Wali Allah, who will take a sort of different path from Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab. Then he goes on to Basra. Now, Basra would be an interesting place for Muhammad. I'm going to call him Sheikh Muhammad from now on, to differentiate him from the Prophet Muhammad. Sheikh Muhammad is up in Basra. Basra is a Shiite-heavy city. And so there he's seeing a cosmopolitanism that maybe he hasn't experienced before, and he does not like it. And eventually his fundamentalist interpretations of the Quran cause him to be expelled from Basra. So what are these doctrines that are so offensive to the people in Basra? Well, Sheikh Muhammad preaches pure monotheism, Tawheed, usually translated as the unity of God or the oneness of God, but I think the best definition is pure monotheism, okay? God as singular. Anything that challenges that idea of God as singular, anything that elevates anything or anyone anywhere close to the status of God, would be a violation of pure monotheism, okay? This is one of the great fundamental ideas of Islam, of one God. It's a monotheist religion, and from the perspective of Sheikh Muhammad, and probably most Muslims today, it is the most monotheistic of religions. God is one, okay? So anything, for example, seeking intercession from a saint. You know, a lot of the Sufi orders, most of them have their saints, and a common belief is that you can go to their tombs and pray to them, and they will intercede for you with God, or intercede for you with Muhammad, or you can pray to Muhammad and he'll intercede for you with God. Well, that elevates them to something approaching the status of God, so that would be not allowed. In fact, having such tombs decorated and set up as essentially shrines, or at least pilgrimage sites, this would also be a violation of pure monotheism. And there's all sorts of other things too. So this is an attempt by Sheikh Muhammad to return to basics, to use only original sources, the Quran and the Sunnah, and nothing else, no accretions, and get back to pure monotheism. So that get back to, we're talking here about a revivalism. He would like to revive the golden age of Islam, the age of Muhammad the Prophet and the 4 rightly guided caliphs. That's where we find the most perfect example of how to live. Anything after that or anything beyond that, he would consider an accretion, something that needs to be, burned out of the community. But it's more than just internal purification of the ummah. He also has a dream of establishing an Islamic state. And for that, he's going to need the help of a temporal ruler. After returning to the Najd, Sheikh Muhammad first goes and joins his father. And then after his father's death, he takes over as a religious judge. He's probably about 40. And it's around this time that he writes his book, the Book of Pure Monotheism, or the Book on Oneness of God. It's really a collection of notes, but well written, easy to ingest, broken up into a bunch of little topics. So very easy to be understood by the common person. And that's going to be important. But he doesn't last long as his father's successor as religious judge. He's considered too strict, too harsh, too fundamentalist. So he's kicked out, but he finds a disciple in the ruler of the village where he'd been born, Uyayna, which is one of 3 or 4 villages in Central Arabia vying for power at the time. Today it's nothing, but at the time it was something. And so he finds a disciple there in the ruler, and he's allowed to institute his system there. But again, very, very harsh. He makes waves almost immediately by cutting down a bunch of sacred trees, or trees considered sacred by the locals. In fact, he cuts down the most sacred of the trees himself. He destroys the tomb of the brother of one of the Rashidun, one of the four rightly guided caliphs, you know, that was considered very sacred to locals and pilgrims alike, but he considered it idolatry, and Muslims who engaged in that sort of behavior as apostates. And so he destroyed the tomb there. At one point, he even oversaw the stoning of a woman for adultery. And this was sort of the last straw. At this point, he has enough opposition, both local and more from afar, that he's expelled. In fact, the ruler of Uyayna is pressured by those who give him subsidies. They say, we're going to stop these subsidies unless you kill this Sheikh Muhammad. Well, he expels him instead, although he does apparently send a soldier after him to kill him, but the soldier gets cold feet. And so Sheikh Muhammad lives to see another day. And this time Sheikh Muhammad finds refuge right here in Dir'aya, where the emir is named Muhammad ibn Saud. So the fateful year is 1744. Some sources say 1745. But 1744, the year that this alliance between the house of Saud and the house of the Sheikh, the house of Wahhab, is made. So what do both sides get out of this deal, out of this alliance? Well, the Saudis get religious legitimacy. Actually, the Saudis are actually looking for legitimacy in terms of being able to tax the harvest. And Sheikh Mohammed says no. He says, don't worry. You side with me. War booty will be what fills your coffers. And so that's what the Saudis agree to. In exchange for religious legitimacy and war booty, promised war booty, they will ally with the house of the Sheikh. The house of the Sheikh, of course, he gets the temporal ruler, he gets the patron, he gets the sword, he gets the military support for the establishment of his pure Islamic state. Well, the alliance is sealed in part by marriage. The daughter of the Sheikh ends up marrying into the family, and these families will intermarry. But over the next 27 years or so it's not easy, over the next 27 years or so, military conquest is the name of the game. War is the name of the game, as the House of Saud and the House of the Sheikh attempt to establish dominance in Central Arabia. And typically what they do is they'll conquer a village and pillage the village, then they'll establish occupation forces in the village, and then they'll install Wahhabi scholars in the village to preach Sheikh Muhammad's system. And then that village will pay tribute, which will be characterized as an Islamic tax. But in practical terms, it's a tribute to Dirya, to the House of Saud. And those coffers really do fill up. And over the years, though there is dogged resistance from many, the House of Saud is more often than not victorious. And some of the worst resistance comes from Riyadh, which is nearby. Today, Dirya is basically a suburb of modern Riyadh, a few miles away from each other back then. And the Emir of Riyadh able to hold out for decades. But finally, in 1773 or 1774, depending on the source, Riyadh surrenders, and the Emir essentially flees. He leaves the city open for the Saudis to come and take over. And Riyadh, the last great stronghold, falls, and the Saudi Wahhabis reign supreme in Central Arabia. And by the way, all of this conquest is characterized as jihad. Okay, jihad, according to the understanding of scholars like Ibn Taymiyyah or Sheikh Muhammad, as a holy war, not just an internal struggle, but a holy war. Okay, so what were raids, and as I mentioned, Central Arabia was no stranger to raids, not by a long shot. Well, those same raids can now be characterized as jihad. And those same raiders can now be characterized as holy warriors. And so this infuses zeal and legitimacy into what before had been raiding and criminal activity. This, by the way, is, I mean, arguably he's following the example of the Prophet Muhammad, who did the same thing. Muslims could not raid other Muslims, but you were free to raid the infidels. And Muhammad himself led many raids against the non-believers, and back then set the precedent for 1/5 of all booty to to go to him. So Sheikh Mohammed institutes the same thing. 1/5 of all booty goes to the Saudis, the Saudi Wahhabis, and the rest is divided among the raiders. But in this way, you have religious legitimacy. It's a jihad, it's not a raid. And there's a sort of moral superiority infusing the whole project. But again, around the same time as the American Revolution is starting on the east coast of North America, the Saudis and Wahhabis have established their dominance in Central Arabia, and we have the emergence of the first Saudi state. Well, the Saudi Wahhabis are not done. Though Riyadh has fallen and Central Arabia seems secure, there's more expansion to come. So Muhammad ibn Saud had died in 1765, and he'd been succeeded by his son Abdul Aziz ibn Muhammad ibn Saud. So Abdul Aziz is the one who oversees the final conquest of Riyadh. The military success is often led by Abdul Aziz's son. Abdul Aziz is often in charge militarily, but his son Saud is also a great military leader. And we'll see that at this point, the Saudi Wahhabis are being taken seriously. In fact, their main rival now on the peninsula, the Sharif of Mecca. The Sharif of Mecca for a long time, up into the 20th century, is going to consider himself the true leader of the Arabs, or at least the true leader of the Arabs on the peninsula. In the 20th century, it's going to be leader of all Arabs. So the Sharif, that's the Sharif of Mecca. And the Sharif of Mecca decides it's time to humble these Wahhabis, and so sends an army in 1790, bands up with a bunch of Central Arabian tribes that still don't support the Saudis, and launch an attack against the Saudis, and are defeated. Well, a second army is sent in the mid-1790s. It's defeated. A third army is sent in the late 1790s. This is a big one, and it includes mercenaries from Egypt and Morocco and Turkey, but it is defeated. And so in the year 1800, the Sharif of Mecca has no choice but to allow Abdul Aziz, together with his son Saud and Wahhabi scholars, to perform the Hajj, to make the Hajj to Mecca. And they make the Hajj again in 1801, and they are well received and treated respectfully. So that's in the West. In the East, by the mid-1790s, the Saudis have conquered virtually all of Eastern Arabia. Wahhabis begin to raid north too, towards Iraq. Well, this gets the Ottomans' attention, and so they actually dispatch an army, an Ottoman army, straight up from Baghdad, south into Saudi territory. And though they are able to lay siege to several strongholds, they're not able to take them, and the army is turned around. Well, in 1802, two events that would prove to be momentous in the history of the first Saudi state took place. Okay, the first of the events took place right here. I'm in Taif, which is a very short distance to Mecca, just over the mountains, 30-40 miles. Today you can drive it in an hour. Okay, Taif. A Wahhabi force shows up at Taif and sacks the city, the sack of Taif. Apparently very, very destructive. An eyewitness that was here 10 years later said that the city was still largely in ruins. Okay, so the sack of Taif. Important too, because this gives the Saudi Wahhabis a foothold in the Hijaz. So the conquest of the Hijaz now has a staging ground. Of course, the Sharif of Mecca, very, very worried, and he's going to call on the Ottomans for help. So the sack of Taif, event number 1 in 1802. Event number 2 in 1802, the sack of Karbala. A Saudi Wahhabi force raids Karbala. Of course, this is a major center in the Islamic world. This is a great Shiite center. This is the site of the original Shiite-Sunni split. This is where the tomb of Imam Hussein is. This is where the mosque of Imam Hussein is. These are very holy sites for Shiites. And what do the Wahhabis do? Well, they slaughter many of the inhabitants of the city, and they destroy the dome over the tomb, and they loot and pillage the mosque. In fact, they get so much booty from the mosque that some wonder if this isn't the real reason for the raid. So if the Ottomans didn't take the Saudis seriously before, they do after 1802. Well, the next year, 1803, the Saudi Wahhabis took Mecca. Okay, this is huge. They took Mecca, and they were able to take Mecca in part because they were able to gain the cooperation of the tribes of Asir south of the Hijaz, there in western Arabia. Apparently, the Sharif of Mecca was a high taxer. And by promising lower taxes, the Wahhabis, the Saudis, were able to convince these tribes from Asir to join their side. And together, they took Mecca almost without a fight in 1803. This is huge. As the Saudi Wahhabis, in revivalist style, almost reenact the mission of Muhammad back in the day. They retake Mecca just like Muhammad had taken Mecca. They take Mecca now, and they control the pilgrimage route, and they are the custodians of the Kaaba. This is huge for their legitimacy. This is a great blow to the legitimacy of Ottomans, who call themselves caliphs. They call themselves the guardians of the holy cities. Well, now they don't even control the holy cities, and pilgrims must follow the rules set forth and enforced by the Wahhabis. And depending on who you want to read, the Wahhabis were good to the pilgrims and respectful, or they were terrible. They harassed the pilgrims. They had all these behavioral injunctions that they enforced violently. They charged exorbitant fees to the pilgrims. It's hard to know what actually happened, but these are the stories going around. And of course, in Mecca itself, the Wahhabis do what they do. They, destroy the domes over tombs, the domes over mosques. They ban all sorts of behavior, homosexuality, prostitution. Apparently, these are pretty common in Mecca before the Wahhabis. There are neighborhoods of prostitutes all over the place. The Wahhabis ban all that, ban alcohol consumption, ban music, other entertainments. They enforce, mandatory prayer, enforce mandatory mosque attendance. Mecca is Wahhabi, but not for long. That same year, 1803, the Ottomans are able to retake Mecca and send the Saudi Wahhabis packing. Saud has to leave anyway. Saud, who led the conquest of Mecca, he's got to leave anyway because someone has assassinated his father, Abdul Aziz, back in Diraya. Who is that someone? A Sufi Kurd who had been an eyewitness to the massacre at Karbala. He'd seen the slaughter. He determined to get revenge and followed Abdul Aziz back to Diraya and assassinated him. Okay, so Saud rushes back to Diraya and is able to secure the succession for himself. And he's not done. He's ready to continue the offensive. Under Saud, the Saudi Wahhabis raid Basra. They raid the Hijaz. Between 1805 and 1806, they retake Mecca. They take Medina. The Wahhabis now control the holy cities, and they will for years. And they keep going. Wahhabi Saudi forces will raid in Iraq. They'll raid in Syria. They're usually targeting villages. They stay away from the big urban centers for the most part. But wherever they go, they insist upon the local submission to the Wahhabi system. They plunder, they slaughter civilians, they destroy sacred sites, and they insist on submission to Wahhabism. Okay, so what we're seeing here is something similar, maybe, to what we see back in the days of the Prophet. Once he'd united most of the peninsula, that raiding energy is then pointed outside of the peninsula. And we see the same thing here. Once the Saudi Wahhabis controlled not just the holy cities and not just Diraya, but most of the peninsula from the Red Sea to the Persian Gulf, a lot of that raiding energy then gets pushed north, out, into Iraq, into Syria and elsewhere. Well, beginning in 1813, the Saudi Wahhabis experience a series of setbacks, one after the other after the other. So in 1813, the Ottomans are able to retake Mecca and Medina. And they do this by calling on the army of Muhammad Ali of Egypt. Okay, so this is the greatest army in the Ottoman world. Muhammad Ali, a bit of an independent actor, he's got reasons of his own to accept this mission and to want to extend his power across the Red Sea into Arabia. Of course, he's got proximity right there. This will give him control of the Hijaz and the holy cities. This boosts his legitimacy. He has other reasons too, but he agrees. He sends an army. They've got artillery. They've got all the modern weaponry. They're drilled in the most modern tactics. These are crack troops. And again, they're able to retake Mecca and Medina in the name of the Ottomans in 1813. Huge loss for the Saudis. And then the next year, Saud himself dies. Now, in the midst of war, to lose your battle-hardened veteran leadership, mostly successful leadership, And that can be tough to overcome. And that happens to the Saudis with the death of Saud, and he's succeeded by Abdullah. And then the next year, 1815, there's a great battle, the Battle of Taraba, where a 30,000-man army, Saudi army, is wiped out by the forces of Muhammad Ali. Okay, major setback, because this opens up the Asir region for conquest by the Egyptians in 1816, the next year. So it's one after the other. 1816, the Egyptians take Asir and now control all of Western Arabia. And it's at this point that Muhammad Ali orders his son, Ibrahim Pasha, to take a 7,000-man army deep into Central Arabia and hit the Saudi Wahhabis where it hurts most, at home. Well, Ibrahim Pasha's campaign in Qasim and the Nejd, devastating, brutal. And he moves against villages and civilians, destroying, killing. Thousands are killed by Ibrahim Pasha. In fact, he keeps count. He was going to send heads back to his father, but instead he decides economically it's better to send ears. So he chops off the ears of the dead and sends them back to his father as trophies. Look how well I'm doing, Dad. And eventually he reaches Diraya, able to defeat the forces defending Diraya and razes Diraya to the ground. The first Saudi state is done. Hundreds from the House of Saud, hundreds from the House of the Sheikh, captured, deported to Cairo prisons where they're just going to rot. Abdullah himself is deported to a Cairo prison, and then after about 6 months, he's moved to Istanbul, where he's paraded through the streets. You have wildly cheering Turks in the streets, cheering the capture of this great raider who's caused so much trouble, whose family has caused so much trouble over the years in the Islamic world, from their perspective. They cheer him in chains as he's paraded through the streets, and then eventually he's beheaded there, and thus ends the first Saudi state. Now, before he left the Nejd, Ibrahim Pasha destroyed food stores. Any food stores he could find, he destroyed. He wants to make sure the Saudis never rise again. But unfortunately for Ibrahim Pasha, it only took a few years for the Saudis to reassert themselves. But that's another story.